Welcome. We're now in week 3, and we're going to be talking about the structure of a research paper. The videos this week will be a mix of slides and internet browser stuff in this first one, and then I'll also have some videos of me teaching at the blackboard for some of the specific content as well. So hopefully those will both work out okay. Let me quickly check that I'm recording properly. Okay, looks good. So this week we're talking about the structure of a research paper. And there was a reading from the Perry text that I posted on the website where he basically sticks to what I'm calling the classical format. And so this is going to be an important overarching schema for reading research papers. Although, as I'll suggest today, depending on what you're reading, the specific structure you get might be quite different from this. But this is going to be one of the most common kinds of research papers that you'll run into when you're looking for research. And it's useful to understand the structure of this classical format because it's going to give you clues about where you want to look in the paper, what you're expecting to find in different sections, and it will help you process things that you're reading more efficiently, more productively. So one of the sort of tricks of learning to consume research in an efficient manner is that professional researchers who are sort of trying to search the literature and recover facts really fast, we don't often read every sentence of papers that we're looking at. We often take a look at specific parts of the paper where we're expecting to find relevant information to know if we want to look at it in more detail or to know whether we're able to abstract or extract, what we need to get out of the paper without reading the entire thing. And I mean, this is sort of just a fact on the ground about how people actually do research. We don't read every sentence of every relevant paper. We look in specific places, we skim, we hop from place to place, we get the information that we need out of a paper, and then we move on, right? So this is one of the primary skills that allows you to really go through an area of scientific literature smoothly and efficiently. So understanding this classical format, it's not going to be relevant to every single paper you find, but it will be relevant to a large portion of them. And so it's worth understanding this classical format. It comes out of the laboratory sciences. And if you're American, at least, you may have learned about this format when you took science classes in high school, where they talk about laboratory reports. Like if you're working in a chemistry lab or in a physics lab or something like that, this is the format that you use to write up laboratory findings. So it has 4 basic parts. We're going to go through this in more detail in another video, but just to introduce the sort of overarching structure here, the first part is the introduction, and this gives you some background on the topic, what people have said about it before, why we're studying this particular thing, why it's interesting. There will be a description of the methods used, in this case, almost always to run an experiment or some kind of empirical investigation of the phenomena of interest. And they'll tell you all about how they did it. In the third section, they will report what happened when they did that investigation, whether it's an experiment or a statistical study or a computational simulation or whatever, a survey, a questionnaire. They're going to tell you what they found when they went out and did the investigation and got the data back. And then the last part is going to be the discussion section, sometimes also with a conclusion section, where they talk about what those results mean with reference to the stuff we started out talking about in the introduction. What did we learn here, right? So that's going to be the broad outline, and I'll go through this in more detail shortly, but I wanted to first say a few more words about tracking down research. These are things that might have come up when you were looking through papers for your first assignment, or if you've started the second assignment, or if you're just reading around to see what you can find. You might have run into some articles that you really want to see, but you're having trouble finding them on, say, the library website or in the databases that were linked there. So I wanted to give you a few more ideas if you're having trouble tracking things down through the normal sort of library means. Here are some other ideas. In basic linguistics in particular, people will often post their papers on their personal websites. And so this is very customary in basic linguistics. I think a little bit less so in applied linguistics and TESOL, although you'll probably still find some personal websites that have papers posted. Often there are legal constraints from the journal publisher about what you can post for free on your website. So you'll see people posting things that they call preprints or accepted manuscripts where they don't look like they're in the format of the actual professional scholarly journal in which they were published, but they're basically the same paper as produced by my word processor or something like that. So this can be a very useful thing to do, is to look at the author's personal websites to see if maybe they posted a copy of the paper that you're unable to track down with the library. That's definitely a thing to look at. So you can't find the paper, try Googling one of the authors or multiple authors, see if you can find their websites and see if they post things on their websites. Journal access at WVU, and this refers to, does our library have a subscription to this super expensive scholarly journal? And often the answer is yes, but you're going to find, some journals somewhere that you're unable to access. And so a lot of this is what happens if we don't have access to that journal. You'll also find sometimes that we have a subscription to a journal through the library, but the electronic version only goes back, 5 years or 10 years, and you want something that's earlier than that. So this is when these kinds of other search items sort of come into practice. And if you're unable to get to the PDF, like full text version of a paper, it's always a good idea to just go back to the library website and check in the journals section. Do we have access to this journal, and just click through to the journal. Sometimes the link to a specific paper won't work right, or maybe you found the reference to the paper outside the library website, but if you go check the library website, we very well might have access to that journal if you plug it in, and then you can follow the links through and try to find it. Here is a sort of interesting one that I never know whether to put this in the slides for this class, but I've decided it's a piece of important information worth knowing. There is a website called Sci-Hub, spelled just like this, SCI-Hub. It exists, it is extraordinarily useful, and it is also completely illegal. What is Sci-Hub? Well, it is a website that was set up by a graduate student from Kazakhstan. And you can imagine that Kazakhstan has, pretty well-developed academic system, but they don't have the kind of money that universities have in, Western Europe or in the United States. And this is going to be true all over the world in less wealthy nations. Right? And so the library at a Kazakh university is probably not going to be able to afford hundreds of thousands of dollars in journal subscription fees, right, for these journals that are published by for-profit publishers. This Kazakh grad student basically started a website where people in the wealthy, developed, industrialized world send in their university credentials to get into different journal websites. And Sci-Hub goes and downloads millions and millions and millions of peer-reviewed journal articles and puts them in a central repository that you can search. Now, this website moves around a lot because it is in violation of copyright laws and is illegal, just about everywhere in the world. That said, if you Google Sci-Hub, you will be able to track down its current coordinates, and you will be able to find almost any peer-reviewed research in any field in the world. It's an incredible resource. Now, why am I talking about this if it's illegal and I'm definitely not allowed to recommend you use this at the university? Well, there's a reason why this Kazakh grad student has put this website together, and it's because of an injustice in the political economy of academic publishing. This is kind of a crazy system. I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about it. How does academic publishing work? Well, if you work at a university and research is part of your job description, then you need to publish in peer-reviewed journals. And peer-reviewed journals get credibility, right? Or they get prestige by basically their reputation, by their history of having published good papers before. People know this journal. We know it's a reputable journal. So if Jonah publishes in there during his annual review, we see that he published in this peer-reviewed journal, we're going to say, way to go, Jonah, good job, right? Because we know that journal, that's a real one. Now, many or most of these journals over time have been bought up by giant publishing conglomerates that exist in the wealthy, industrialized Western world. The biggest one is Elsevier, which is a Dutch company, although there's other very large publishers as well that just own hundreds and hundreds of these journals. and they hide every article that's produced in there behind a paywall and charge university libraries unbelievably high charges to access these journals, despite the fact that the research itself has been done by the people who work at the universities. Oftentimes, it's funded by public money from taxpayers, or the university itself that allowed the research to happen is funded by public money. Somehow, these private companies end up owning the copyrights to everybody's published papers, and they want to charge you thousands of dollars to access them. In the US or in Western Europe, this is something of a problem because really these companies are taking extortionary profits off of our universities, which already have funding problems. But in other areas of the world where universities have even fewer resources, like Kazakhstan, right, or parts of Africa and the Middle East and Asia, where you have less wealthy countries, this is actually a fatal problem. It means that you're never going to be able to access this peer-reviewed research because it's paywalled by these for-profit companies that didn't actually make the research in the first place. And so Sci-Hub is an attempt to bypass this system. There's been a movement throughout the world within the last decade or so to try to break the power of these publishers by refusing to work for them. But that movement is, it hasn't completely succeeded. There are still significant barriers to tracking down research and being able to read it, even research that was funded by public taxpayer money. And so Sci-Hub is an attempt to help break this publishing system and to make it more fair and equitable for students and researchers who live in less wealthy countries where you can't pay $200,000 to access Elsevier's journals in a year. So it's illegal. It violates copyright laws. I'm not allowed to endorse it. But I think there's an argument for why Sci-Hub is justified in some ways. All right, so that's my little excursus on the political economy of academic publishing. And then if all else fails, if you just can't find the thing anywhere on the internet, so first of all, Google would fall into this category. The last thing to try is just Googling it. Google the author and the name of the paper and see if somebody might have just randomly posted a PDF somewhere. You'll often find that somebody has put it on a course website or just linked from something that they were writing, and they've just posted a copy of it without really advertising it. So nobody's sued them yet, but you might be able to find a PDF that way. Right? The other last thing I would suggest you try, I pulled up the WVU Library's website here, and I've plugged in the name of a paper that I happen to know isn't in our electronic collections, isn't held by our library. So here we're just at libraries.wvu.edu would be the address, or just Google WVU Libraries, go through to the library homepage and enter something in the search box there. So here I've entered the name of some authors. This is Shattuck Hufnagel is one person, and Turk is a second person, and the name of the paper is A Prosody Tutorial for Investigators of blah, 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 right? So I entered this in here because this is a paper I happen to know you can't get through WVU Libraries, but there is another option here. How am I going to get this one? Well, I found it. It's the first result here. You don't see a full text link here. Unlike, articles that we have in electronic format, they'll have this button that says view full text. This one that I'm looking for doesn't have that button. What am I going to do? I'm going to click through here, and we see that there's no access online, but you can request this through either Book Express or through Iliad. This is interlibrary loan, and this is what I recommend. So I can't find this paper. We don't have an electronic version of it. We're going to go to our interlibrary loan program, where WVU Libraries has an agreement with any number of other libraries around the world. I'm going to fill out this form. I'm not actually going to do this because I already have the paper, but you have to sign in with your WVU credentials. It's going to autofill this form for me. So it's already filled out the journal, the article, the authors, and so on and so forth. It's even got these codes that help other libraries track it down. It asks you a couple questions. You submit the request, and the WVU Libraries is going to send me a PDF of this paper within the week, usually. So this usually does not take very long. It's possible there's some delay on this service right now because of the pandemic and the budget cuts and everything else. It's not clear to me that the library is operating at full capacity right now, but I think this should still work relatively quickly. And so this is a good last resort. Just about anything that you can't get full text through the normal library website here, you can request through Iliad, and this is a very good resource as well. It will take a few days, but usually not more than that. This is true for books as well, like an entire book. They won't send you a PDF of that usually, but they will actually mail the book from another library. It will show up at the WVU library at whichever branch you pick, and you can go pick your book up. And get the physical book this way as well. Obviously, that option takes a little bit longer, right? Because they have to physically track down the book and mail it from another library. But if it's a journal article, they'll almost always just send you a PDF, a scanned PDF of the paper, sometime within a week. So this is an excellent option if all else fails, if you can't find the paper online anywhere. Okay, so that's my little excursus on tracking down hard to find research items. And let me know if you run into any trouble with this. I can probably help. Back now to the classical format. And again, the way Perry introduces this, it's this sort of overarching four-part format that I'm calling classical, and it consists of these four parts. The introduction, where you talk about the topic and why you're doing the study that you're doing. The methods, where you explain what you did. The results, where you explain what you found when you did the study, and then finally the discussion and conclusion sections where you talk about what we learned and how we want to update our beliefs now that we've seen what happened when we did our study. And that is certainly a very, very common format in any experimental branch of linguistics, and certainly in applied linguistics, if it's any kind of an empirical study, you're going to see something like this four-part organization. But that said, there's also more, I guess they're often called theoretical papers in both basic linguistics and in TESOL and applied linguistics. You get people talking about overarching theories of how some thing or things work, and they might not follow this classical format. So the main point here is you need to be familiar with this classical format, and I'm going to go through it in detail. But you should also expect to see all sorts of other formats, especially if you're looking at more theoretical research that's not necessarily oriented around specific experiments or anything like that. So here's a possible format. And this one is sort of based on what I see as theoretical basic linguistics. You might be arguing not about specific things that do or don't happen in some language, but a way of analyzing things that we take to be common ground in some language or languages. And so if you're arguing for a particular analysis of some existing facts, this is going to be a different kind of paper. So you might take the first section and explain how your analysis works and what's interesting about it. You'd then want to take several sections and devote them to other analyses or theories that people have advanced to explain these kinds of linguistic facts, and say, hey, I have some arguments why my analysis is better than this other previous analysis. Here's a second argument for why my analysis captures these facts really well and other previous analyses don't capture these facts as naturally. On and on, as many arguments as you have. And then when you're done with that, you might say, look, also my analysis has this virtue that if you think about it in a slightly broader way, you might also be able to deal with these other linguistic facts with the same analysis, and that would be helpful. And then for the last section of the paper, I might discuss, what are the consequences and the issues involved in this overarching theoretical approach. I've just spent most of the paper down in the details of trying to explain how specific phenomena work in specific languages. Now let me say a few words about my overall approach to these kinds of facts, and what does that say about the language faculty or the theory of mental grammar or something like that. So this is a possible kind of a format for more theoretical work. Here's another kind of alternative structure. Maybe this one is more centered on showing that two things that looked really different when other people have discussed them could actually be analyzed as related to one another if you adopt my theoretical approach here. So in the introduction, I'm going to talk about what I'm going to do in the paper and how my approach works a little bit. Then I'll go to a relatively brief and straightforward summary of the actual linguistic data or the empirical phenomena that I'm going to argue are related to one another and how they work. I'm going to give an analysis of one of those phenomena and show you how my analysis works, and then show you how you can take this same kind of analysis and extend it to this other phenomenon that maybe we didn't even know was related until now. And maybe I'm going to do that with several other new phenomena. And then finally, in my second to last section, I'm going to say, well, you can imagine that you might not like my approach because it has this property, but let me explain why I think that's not such a problem. Or you might not like the idea that these two phenomena are related to one another because of these other facts, but I think I have a response to that. Right? And then finally, again, I'm going to give a conclusion about what have I done in this paper, what has it accomplished, and what are its advantages over previous approaches. And of course, none of these other formats I'm giving you here are like standardized frameworks. These are just off the top of my head. I can think of theoretical linguistics papers that are structured in this possible way instead of some other possible way. And you could imagine things like this happening in the applied linguistics literature as well, except maybe instead of arguing that two linguistic phenomena are related, you're arguing for a theoretical approach that unifies two constructs or two concepts in applied linguistics or something like that, right? So you will certainly see a lot of the classical four-part format when you look through linguistics and applied linguistics literature, but you will also see other possible formats, and you should be ready for that. Okay, right, and the point here was not that those two other possible formats that I put up here are very, very common or are like formal frameworks that you're going to work in, but just that once you get out of simple reports of laboratory studies, there's lots and lots of alternative possible formats. Now, you tend to find more of the four-part format in areas of linguistics that are more influenced by external fields, and in particular, psychology has a really, really strong and rigid preference for this four-part format. If you go look at the American Psychological Association or APA style guide to how to write research papers, you will find that four-part format is embedded in the APA style approach at every possible juncture. And some areas of linguistics are really wedded to that APA style and to psychology as a field, and that includes most education research. So you certainly will find this a lot, but we are not psychology, and maybe more importantly, psychology itself. They like to think of themselves as a laboratory science, but they are not chemistry and they're not physics. And even for psychology papers, it's not clear to me that four-part laboratory write-up format is really crucial for anything in there. So I'm just trying to make clear here, there are other possible formats in which you can get a research paper in linguistics and in allied fields. Now, I'm going to split out in a moment for a separate video about constructs, but let me first introduce what I'm talking about here. So we're mostly interested when we're doing research in looking at different kinds of theories, right? And these might be theories of linguistic structure, theories of linguistic processing or linguistic production, theories of linguistic learning, theories of classroom strategies and why they work the way they do. But it's going to be some sort of a theory. A theory is an overarching framework for trying to connect things that happen out in the world. And when you get down to the real details of what a theory is, all theories involve some number of constructs. So Perry defines a construct as a concept that a given discipline has constructed to identify some quality that is thought to exist. So what does that mean? Well, a construct is basically what he's saying is that it's a concept that we use in a field. And why is it a concept? Well, it's not something you can point to out in the world and say, look, there is a gluon or something like that. Instead, it's going to be something that's somewhat indirectly connected to actual concrete things in the world. That's what makes a construct a construct. And observation here, essentially everything in linguistics, including applied linguistics, is a construct at some level. So if you work in physics, you might be lucky enough to work with actual particles that you can point to with a microscope and say, there is a gluon, right? Or something like that. But in any human science, right, that's almost never going to be the case. Everything we talk about that's surrounding human beings is a construct at some level. So what do I mean by that? Well, here are some important constructs in basic linguistics, and I'm just going to briefly introduce what these are, and then I'll break off for a Blackboard video. I mean literally Blackboard. I painted a blackboard on the wall of my house where I go through some of these constructs and explain how they're constructs and how they work. And then I'll also talk a little bit about constructs in applied linguistics because the situation is very much the same there. But here are some really basic constructs in linguistics that you've probably heard most or all of these. And you maybe have never really thought about how we use these terms or what they mean, but they really are constructs. They're not things you can point at in the world and say, look, there is a syllable. Right? The syllable is a construct, right? And more generally in basic linguistics, what we're usually studying is a human's implicit knowledge of their language. Right? And implicit knowledge is not a physical thing that you can ever point at or find in a corpus or see in an experiment. You have to use observable things in order to draw inferences about what's in a mental grammar, a system of implicit knowledge for some language. And so when we talk about the syllable, it actually constitutes a certain kind of claim about the way that people organize their knowledge of sounds in their language. Similarly, the noun phrase, right? If you've ever taken an intro linguistic class where they talk about syntax, these kinds of syntactic phrases play a large role in that theory, but they themselves are constructs. You can't point at some object out in the world and say, oh, look, that's a noun phrase. Isn't it cute? Right? A noun phrase is a construct. Here's one, the grammatical sentence or utterance, right? When we talk about knowing a language or learning a language, we're basically assuming a pretty abstract mathematical theory where some strings of words in the language are grammatical or are part of the language and other strings of words are not, right? But that in and of itself is not something that you can observe out in the world, right? You can see what kinds of sentences are used or aren't used, but the number of grammatical sentences in a language is certainly greater than all of the ones that you'll be able to observe in a corpus, and possibly infinite, right? So this itself is a construct. It's not something you can point at in the world. And then finally, this one's maybe kind of surprising, but when we talk about specific languages like the English language or the Spanish language or any other language, this itself is a construct. Right? What we're really talking about at its sort of most basic level here, most fundamental level, is a collection of shared facts that enough speakers in a particular time and place have in common that we can think of them as having the same grammar or speaking the same language. And of course, if you go out there in the world, everybody's linguistic behavior is a little bit different, and probably the implicit knowledge that they possess of their language is also a little bit different. Right? But what we mean when we say that American English works this way is that, well, for enough people who learned their language as a young child in the United States, in this particular time period, they tend to share these common elements in their implicit knowledge of what their language is like, and we can think of those as being American English facts or something like that. And the exact same thing is true of, Peninsular Spanish or Brazilian Portuguese or Moroccan Arabic or any other language variety. It's a construct. Right? It's all constructs all the way down. I'm going to go through some details of these in a separate video in a moment, but first let me talk about why I'm interested in deconstructing these constructs. Right? Well, it's because, in and of itself, the syllable is worth learning about in intro linguistics class. Now, active research in the field is usually not concerned with showing the existence or non-existence of syllables or of noun phrases. These are taken to be basic facts on the ground for the most part. But what that means is that all linguistic hypotheses are going to concern constructs and the relationships between them. So here are actual things that you might find somebody trying to demonstrate or work with in real linguistics research. Here's a statement like English allows closed syllables. And it should be clear to you that every single word in this statement is a construct, right? I just said that the English language is a construct. Syllables are a construct, so of course closed syllables are going to be a slightly more specific variety of that construct. And then even this concept of allows, what does that mean? Well, it's a claim about the implicit knowledge of English speakers. Similarly, Spanish noun phrases require determiners. Again, every single word in this sentence is basically denoting some kind of a linguistic construct. And here's an even more complicated one, which I probably won't go through all the way because it involved like hours of background, but I just wanted to show how complicated these can get when you start building constructs on constructs on constructs. WH movement out of English noun phrases is ungrammatical, right? So this is a hypothesis about constraints on long-distance dependencies that govern the implicit knowledge of speakers of English about grammatical and ungrammatical strings of words in their language. There's a lot of different constructs here that are building on one another, right? And in order to ask questions about these kinds of statements or these hypotheses or research questions, we're first going to need to have some baseline agreement on how to turn constructs like English, syllables, determiners, noun phrases, WH movement. We're going to need to have some kind of baseline agreement on how we might translate those into operational terms. That is, what kind of evidence, what kind of stuff can we look at to know whether statements like this are true, given that the statements are about constructs. So I'm going to make a separate video here in a moment where I deconstruct some of these concepts or constructs that I just mentioned, and then we'll go back to talking about the structure of a research paper.